The day started like any other at Memorial General Hospital in downtown Seattle. The morning sun cast long shadows through the emergency room windows as nurses changed shifts and doctors made their rounds. It was just past 7 a.m. when the automatic doors slid open and a young Asian woman in her early 30s hurried in, clutching something wrapped in a pale blue blanket. The woman's designer clothes were wrinkled, and her usually perfectly styled hair was disheveled as if she hadn't slept in days. In her arms lay a tiny infant, no more than a few weeks old, with fair skin and wispy blonde hair. The contrast between the woman and the baby she carried was impossible to miss. "Please, my baby needs help," she called out, her voice trembling. The urgency in her tone immediately caught the attention of Nurse Richardson, a veteran of 20 years in the ER. As she approached, something about the situation made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The baby was unusually quiet and felt cool to the touch. While Nurse Richardson's instincts screamed that something wasn't right, her professional training kicked in. She quickly ushered mother and child to an examination room, all while noting how the woman's story seemed to shift with each question. "When was the baby born?" Nurse Richardson asked, keeping her voice calm and steady. 3 days ago. No, 5 days, the woman stammered, looking anywhere but at the nurse's face. "It was a home birth. I didn't want to go to the hospital." Her fingers nervously played with the expensive ring on her left hand. As more staff arrived to check on the infant, the woman's behavior became increasingly erratic. She couldn't remember basic details about the birth, fumbled when asked about the baby's feeding schedule, and became defensive when questioned about medical records. The pediatric resident on duty, Dr. Patel, noticed something else concerning. The baby showed signs of being older than the claimed 5 days, closer to 6 weeks old. When she gently pointed this out, the woman's face paled, and she clutched her designer handbag closer. Hospital Security Officer Thompson stood quietly by the door, having been alerted by the staff's subtle signals. Years of experience had taught him to recognize when a situation was about to escalate. He watched as the woman's eyes darted increasingly toward the exit. The tension in the room grew as Nurse Richardson attempted to get the woman to fill out admission paperwork. The forms required basic information: mother's name, baby's date of birth, home address. With each question, the woman's answers became more confused and contradictory. "I just remembered, I have an important meeting," the woman suddenly announced, rising from her chair. "We'll come back later." But as she reached for the baby, Dr. Patel stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "I'm sorry, but given the baby's condition, we need to run some basic tests before you leave. It's hospital policy," she explained firmly but kindly. "It won't take long." The woman's composure cracked. Tears welled up in her eyes, but they weren't tears of maternal concern. They were tears of fear. Her designer purse slipped from her shoulder, spilling its contents across the floor. Among the scattered items, a passport fell open, showing a different name than the one she'd given. Officer Thompson moved slightly closer to the door as Nurse Richardson picked up the hospital phone, her fingers hovering over the keypad. The woman's eyes darted between the baby, the door, and her spilled belongings, like a trapped animal looking for escape. By now, other patients in the ER had noticed the growing tension. An elderly man with a newspaper lowered it to watch. A young mother pulled her child closer. The air felt thick with unspoken questions. In that moment, as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, no one in the emergency room could have guessed that this scene was just the beginning. They couldn't know that this single morning would unravel a story that would shock the community, break hearts, and ultimately bring justice to families across multiple states. The truth about the baby's identity and how he ended up in this woman's arms was far more complex and disturbing than anyone in that emergency room could imagine. But for now, in this frozen moment of tension, all they could do was wait and watch as the situation teetered on the edge of explosion. Standing there in her rumpled designer clothes, the woman who had walked in so confidently just hours before now looked lost and small. The baby, still unusually quiet, was the center of everyone's concern. Little did they know, hundreds of miles away, another family was living through their worst nightmare, and their stories were about to collide in ways no one could predict. As the morning unfolded in the emergency room, the mystery surrounding the baby and the woman deepened with each passing minute. Nurse Richardson had seen many strange situations in her 2 decades at Memorial General, but something about this case made her stomach churn. The baby, still eerily quiet, was now being examined by Dr. Patel in a separate room. His vital signs were stable, but his body temperature was lower than normal. Most concerning was the slight dehydration, a sign he hadn't been fed properly in the last several hours. "When was the last time you fed him?" Dr. Patel asked the woman, who was now sitting rigidly in a plastic chair, her designer purse clutched tightly to her chest after gathering its spilled contents. "This morning, or maybe last night," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes kept darting to the clock on the wall, then to her phone, then back to the door. The nurses exchanged knowing looks. They'd been documenting every inconsistency in the woman's story, and the list was growing longer by the minute. The claimed home birth location changed 3 times. The birth date she gave didn't match the baby's apparent development. Even the way she held the infant seemed awkward and unpracticed, not like a mother who had been caring for her child since birth. Officer Thompson had quietly called for backup, and 2 plainclothes detectives were now in the hospital, watching from a distance. They noticed how the woman flinched every time her phone buzzed, how she kept checking the emergency exit signs. Nurse Richardson decided to try a different approach. She sat down next to the woman, offering her a cup of water. "You must be exhausted," she said gently. "Taking care of a newborn is hard work, especially on your own. Is there someone we can call for you? Your family?" "The baby's father." The woman's hands trembled as she took the cup. No family here," she said quickly, too quickly. "His father is away on business." Just then, a young intern rushed into the room, holding some papers. The woman's head snapped up, her entire body tensing. The intern whispered something to Dr. Patel, whose expression changed subtly as she looked at the documents. The papers showed the results of the baby's initial examination. The infant was not a newborn, he was approximately 6 weeks old. More importantly, there were traces of prescription formula in his system, the kind typically given in hospitals right after birth. This directly contradicted the woman's story of a home birth. The tension in the room was palpable. The woman must have sensed something was wrong because she suddenly stood up, her designer heels clicking on the linoleum floor. "I need to use the restroom," she announced, grabbing her purse. "Of course," Nurse Richardson said calmly. "Let me show you where it is." She gestured to a female security officer who had been standing quietly in the corner to follow them. As they walked down the corridor, the woman's phone buzzed again. This time, a text message flashed across the screen before she could hide it. The nurse caught a glimpse of the words, "Get out now," before the phone disappeared into the purse. Back in the examination room, Dr. Patel was making another disturbing discovery. The baby had a small birthmark behind his left ear, a detail that would soon prove crucial to unraveling the mystery. The hospital staff had dealt with difficult situations before, but this was different. Every instinct told them they were witnessing something much bigger than a simple case of a worried mother bringing in her sick child. Meanwhile, hospital security cameras captured a dark sedan circling the parking lot for the 3rd time in an hour. The driver never parked, just kept making slow loops around the building. Officer Thompson noted the out-of-state plates and called it in. The woman returned from the restroom looking even more agitated. Her makeup, perfectly applied earlier, was now slightly smeared. She had changed her clothes in the bathroom, switching her designer outfit for simpler attire from her large purse. Another red flag. As the morning wore on, more inconsistencies emerged. The social security number she provided didn't match any records. The address on her driver's license turned out to be a vacant lot. Each piece of information she gave seemed to lead to another dead end. The baby, now receiving proper care and hydration, had started to show more normal infant behavior. He cried when hungry and settled easily after feeding, but notably, he showed no signs of recognition or comfort when the woman tried to hold him. The hospital staff maintained their professional demeanor, but beneath the surface, they were building a case. Years of training had taught them to spot the signs of something wrong, and right now, every sign was screaming that this baby didn't belong with this woman. They just had to keep her there long enough to uncover the truth, while ensuring the safety of the infant who seemed to be at the center of an increasingly complex situation. Little did they know, The next few hours would reveal a story more shocking than any of them could have imagined. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the hospital windows as Detective Rodriguez walked through the emergency room doors. She wasn't in uniform, just a simple blazer and slacks, but her presence commanded attention. 20 years of investigating missing persons cases had taught her that time was always of the essence. The first thing she noticed was the tense atmosphere at the nurses' station. Hospital staff moved with deliberate calm, but their eyes kept darting toward room 104, where the woman and baby were being held under the guise of routine medical tests. "What do we know so far?" Detective Rodriguez asked quietly, accepting a thick folder from Nurse Richardson. "The baby's approximately 6 weeks old, not 5 days as claimed. Healthy overall, but slightly dehydrated. The woman's story has more holes than a fishing net," the nurse explained, keeping her voice low. "And there's something else. Security footage shows she arrived in a car with Nevada plates, but she claims to live locally." Detective Rodriguez nodded, flipping through the pages of contradictory statements and medical observations. 20 minutes of reviewing the file confirmed her initial suspicions. This was no simple case of confused documentation. Meanwhile, in room 104, the woman's composure was cracking. Her designer clothes had been replaced with simpler attire, but expensive diamond earrings still glinted beneath her hastily tied hair. Her phone, which she checked compulsively, had been buzzing with increasingly frequent messages. The detective watched through the observation window as a nurse checked the baby's vitals. The infant's pale blue eyes were alert now, tracking movement around the room, but notably never focusing on the woman who claimed to be his mother. "Let's see what we're dealing with," Detective Rodriguez murmured, straightening her blazer before entering the room. The next hour unfolded like a careful dance. Every question from the detective was met with a slightly different version of the previous answers. The woman's claimed home address changed twice more. Her explanation for the baby's birth certificate, supposedly lost in a recent move, grew more elaborate with each telling. But it was the security footage that broke the case wide open. While the detective questioned the woman, tech specialists were reviewing camera feeds from the hospital parking lot. They discovered something crucial. The woman hadn't arrived alone. A dark sedan had dropped her off, circled the building several times, then disappeared. The same car had been spotted at 3 other hospitals in the past week, each time with different passengers, but always following the same pattern. Detective Rodriguez's phone buzzed quietly in her pocket. A text from her team. They'd identified the car's owner, and the results were troubling. The vehicle was registered to a shell company linked to a series of suspicious adoption cases across 3 states. The investigation was expanding by the minute. What had started as a suspicious incident in an emergency room was unraveling into something much larger. Field agents were already being dispatched to various locations, following leads that seemed to multiply with each new piece of information. Back in room 104, the detective noticed something subtle but significant. Every time hospital staff mentioned Child Protective Services, the woman's right hand would twitch toward her phone, as if fighting the urge to send a message. It was the kind of detail that often broke cases wide open. "Let's talk about Nevada," Detective Rodriguez said casually, watching the woman's reaction. The slight widening of eyes, the quick dart of her gaze toward the door, these small tells spoke volumes. Outside the room, hospital security had quietly increased their presence. Officer Thompson coordinated with local police to secure all exits. They had learned from experience that suspects in these cases often had elaborate escape plans. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A nurse changing the baby's blanket discovered a tiny tag sewn into the fabric. A manufacturer's label from a hospital supply company that served only 3 facilities in the country. None of them were anywhere near Seattle. Detective Rodriguez laid out photos from the hospital security cameras on the small table. "These show you arriving at 7:15 a.m., she said calmly. They'd also show the same car at 4 other hospitals in 3 different states. Want to tell me about that?" The woman's hands began to shake. Her expensive manicure tapped nervously against the metal table. The careful facade she'd maintained was beginning to crack, revealing glimpses of fear beneath the polished surface. Just then, another detective entered the room, holding a tablet. On the screen was an MBR alert from Nevada. featuring a photo of a baby with a distinctive birthmark behind his left ear, identical to the infant now sleeping peacefully in the hospital crib. The pieces were falling into place, revealing a picture more complex and disturbing than anyone had initially imagined. As Detective Rodriguez prepared to make an official arrest, she knew this was just the beginning. Somewhere out there, a family was searching for their child, and the woman in room 104 was their first real lead in weeks. The afternoon sun had begun to set, casting long shadows through the hospital windows. In the quiet of room 104, justice was about to be served, but the full story was still unfolding. The real question wasn't just how this baby had ended up in Seattle, it was how many other families were out there, waiting for answers of their own. In a quiet suburb of Henderson, Nevada, a modest two-story house stood dark and silent. Inside, a nursery painted in soft blues and whites remained exactly as it had been 5 days ago, a mobile of stars and moons hanging motionless above an empty crib, a half-full bottle still sitting on the changing table. The mother sat in the rocking chair, staring at her phone, waiting for any news. She hadn't slept properly since that terrible night. Dark circles under her eyes told the story of endless hours spent hoping, praying, and wondering where her 6-week-old son could be. The father paced the living room downstairs, wearing the same path in the carpet he'd been walking for days. Police officers came and went, neighbors dropped off meals that went uneaten, and still, the house felt emptier than it ever had before. Any updates? He called up the stairs, his voice hoarse from endless phone calls to law enforcement, hospitals, and anyone who might have information. Nothing new, his wife responded, her voice barely above a whisper. The past 5 days had felt like 5 years. Their son had vanished from his crib in the middle of the night, leaving behind only a broken window latch and footprints in the garden below. The investigation had started immediately. Police found evidence of careful planning. The security camera had been disabled, and the phone lines had been cut. Whoever had taken their baby knew exactly what they were doing. The local community had rallied around them. Hundreds of volunteers searched the surrounding areas. Missing posters covered every lamppost and store window in a 50-mile radius. Local news stations ran the story every hour, showing pictures of the smiling infant with his distinctive birthmark behind his left ear. But as the days passed, hope began to fade. The police had few leads. The FBI's involvement brought more resources but no answers. Each passing hour felt like torture for the parents who couldn't bear to look at the empty nursery but couldn't bring themselves to close the door either. Their lives had become a blur of police interviews, press conferences, and sleepless nights. The mother could still feel the weight of her son in her arms, could still smell his baby powder scent on the unwashed blanket she refused to let anyone touch. The father had taken leave from work, spending his days coordinating with law enforcement and managing the growing social media campaign. Their dining room table had become a command center, covered with maps, timelines, and lists of potential leads. Friends and family members took shifts staying with them, making sure they ate, trying to keep their spirits up. But nothing could fill the deafening silence where their baby's coos and cries should have been. On this particular afternoon, the mother was going through security camera footage from neighboring houses for the 100th time. She knew every frame by heart: the quiet street at 2 a.m., a dark car passing by at 2:17, then nothing until the morning when they discovered their son was gone. The father had just finished another call with the detective assigned to their case when his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from his sister, who was helping coordinate the volunteer search efforts. "Turn on the news," the message read. "Channel 8. Now." With trembling hands, he grabbed the remote. The local news anchor's voice filled the room, reporting breaking news from Seattle. As the story unfolded, both parents froze, their eyes fixed on the screen. The mother's phone rang. It was the FBI agent handling their case. "We think we found him," the agent said, her voice carefully controlled. A woman brought a baby matching his description to a hospital in Seattle. The birthmark matches. "We're waiting for final confirmation." The world seemed to stop spinning. The mother gripped the rocking chair so hard her knuckles turned white. The father sank to his knees, still clutching the phone. After 5 days of darkness, a tiny ray of hope had broken through. But questions still swirled. Who had taken their baby? Why Seattle? Was he really okay? The answers would come soon enough, But for now, they clung to each other and to the possibility that their nightmare might finally be ending. In the nursery, the mobile above the crib began to turn slowly in the breeze from the air conditioning, casting dancing shadows on the wall. The house didn't feel quite so empty anymore. For the first time in 5 days, the possibility of their son's return felt real. The mother stood up, walked to the crib, and touched the soft blanket lying there. "Hold on, baby," she whispered. "We're coming to get you." Behind her, her husband was already on the phone, booking the next flight to Seattle. Their story was far from over, but after endless days of despair, hope had finally returned to the little house in Henderson. As they rushed to pack bags and make arrangements, neither parent could know that their personal tragedy was about to uncover something much bigger. A story that would shock communities across multiple states and change lives forever. The breakthrough at Memorial General Hospital came from an unexpected source. A young nurse, working her third double shift that week, was scrolling through her phone during a quick coffee break when something caught her eye. The Amber Alert from Nevada showed a baby with a distinctive birthmark, one that matched exactly what she had seen earlier that day. Her hands shaking with the realization, she nearly spilled her coffee as she rushed to find Detective Rodriguez. The detective was reviewing security footage when the nurse burst into the room, holding up her phone with the alert. "The birthmark," the nurse said breathlessly. "Behind the left ear, it's identical. I'm certain it's the same baby." Detective Rodriguez examined the photo carefully, comparing it to the medical notes they had taken. The birthmark was unique. A small, light brown patch shaped almost like a crescent moon. The odds of two babies having the exact same mark in the exact same spot were astronomical. Within minutes, the quiet efficiency of the investigation exploded into urgent action. The FBI field office in Seattle was contacted. Agents who had been working the Nevada kidnapping case were already boarding a plane. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. Back in the hospital room, the woman was becoming increasingly agitated. Her phone kept buzzing with messages she couldn't answer because of the police presence. Each time it vibrated, she flinched slightly, as if each message carried a threat rather than reassurance. The detectives' team had been tracking the dark sedan spotted in the parking lot. Traffic cameras caught it heading east on the interstate, then north toward Canada. 3 people were in the car, all potentially connected to what was beginning to look like an organized operation. Hospital security footage from the past month revealed something even more disturbing. The same car had been seen at 5 different hospitals in 3 states. Each time, a different woman would enter with a baby, claim medical emergencies, then disappear before questions could be asked. They had never stayed long enough to raise serious suspicions until now. Detective Rodriguez spread photographs across the interview room table. Each image showed a different hospital, a different woman, but always the same car lurking in the background. The pattern was clear, but the question remained: how many babies had been taken? How many families were out there searching? The woman in custody finally broke her silence when confronted with the evidence. Her expensive mascara smeared as tears rolled down her cheeks. She wasn't the mastermind, she claimed. She was just a small part of something much bigger. As she began to talk, the full scope of the operation emerged. It stretched across multiple countries, involving fake adoption agencies, forged documents, and desperate families on both sides of the law. Some believed they were participating in legal private adoptions. Others knew exactly what they were doing. The FBI agents arrived as the sun was setting. They brought with them files containing similar cases from across the country, a pattern of disappearances and suspicious adoptions that had puzzled law enforcement for months. Meanwhile, in Nevada, the baby's parents were boarding an emergency flight to Seattle. They carried nothing but a small bag and their son's favorite blanket, their hearts pounding with equal measures of hope and fear. The hospital staff watched as more law enforcement officials arrived. The quiet emergency room from that morning had become the center of an investigation that would make national headlines. But for now, their focus remained on the small baby sleeping peacefully in the pediatric ward, unaware that he was at the heart of such a massive case. Detective Rodriguez stood at the window of the interview room, watching the woman who had brought the baby in. She was no longer the confident person who had walked through the hospital doors that morning. Now she sat slumped in her chair, her designer clothes wrinkled, her carefully constructed facade crumbling as she realized the magnitude of what she had been involved in. The detective's phone buzzed, another message from her team. They had found a warehouse in Vancouver filled with baby supplies and forged documents. The operation was bigger than anyone had imagined, but today's events would lead to its downfall. Outside the hospital, news vans were beginning to arrive. The story was breaking across multiple networks, but inside, in a quiet room under guard, a baby boy slept soundly, unaware that his kidnapping had just helped uncover one of the largest trafficking operations in recent history. As the evening wore on, more details emerged. Each piece of information revealed new connections, new suspects, new victims. But for Detective Rodriguez, the most important moment was still to come, when she could reunite a baby boy with the parents who had been searching for him desperately for 5 long days. The pieces had finally fallen into place, but this was just the beginning. The story that started with one woman walking into a hospital with a suspicious story would lead to dozens of arrests, multiple international investigations, and most importantly, would bring hope to families who had been searching for answers for far too long. The tension in Memorial General Hospital reached its peak as the afternoon sun began to set. The woman who had brought in the baby was becoming increasingly desperate, her carefully maintained composure cracking under the weight of mounting evidence against her. At 4:17 p.m., everything changed. The woman suddenly stood up during questioning, knocking over her chair. "I need to use the bathroom," she announced abruptly, her voice shaking. Detective Rodriguez noticed her eyes darting between the door and the hallway where the baby was being kept. Before anyone could react, she bolted from the room. Her designer heels clattered against the hospital floor as she ran, pushing past a startled nurse. The sound of breaking medical equipment echoed through the corridor as she knocked over a cart in her desperate escape attempt. Security officers immediately sprang into action, their radios crackling with urgent commands. Detective Rodriguez followed close behind, her years of experience telling her exactly where the woman was headed, toward the pediatric ward. Hospital staff moved quickly to secure the baby, while others helped clear civilians from the halls. Visitors pressed themselves against walls as the chase continued. An elderly patient with a walker was gently pulled aside by a quick-thinking orderly just seconds before the woman ran past. The woman's phone buzzed continuously as she ran. Her accomplices outside were clearly trying to coordinate her escape. Security cameras caught glimpses of the dark sedan moving into position near the emergency exits, its engine running. Running in heels proved to be her downfall, literally. As she rounded the corner near the pharmacy, her ankle twisted. She stumbled but kept moving, now limping noticeably. Her designer bag swung wildly, spilling papers and what looked like multiple fake IDs across the floor. Detective Rodriguez maintained her pursuit, coordinating with hospital security through her radio. "She's heading for the east stairwell," she breathed as she ran. "Block all exits to the parking garage." The woman crashed through the stairwell door, the sound echoing in the confined space. Her heels clattered on the metal stairs as she descended, her breathing ragged and panicked. She was running on pure adrenaline now, all pretense of sophistication gone. 2 floors down, she burst into the parking garage. The screech of tires indicated her accomplices were close, but hospital security had been faster. The garage gates were already closed, trapping the dark sedan inside. Police cars were arriving, their lights flashing against the concrete walls. The woman froze, realizing she was trapped. The sedan's driver attempted to find another exit, but police vehicles had blocked every possible escape route. The echo of squealing tires and revving engines filled the garage as the chase came to its inevitable end. Detective Rodriguez approached carefully, her voice firm but calm. "It's over," she said. "Don't make this worse than it already is." The woman's legs gave out, and she sank to the concrete floor, her expensive clothes now dirty and torn. Tears streamed down her face, smearing her makeup. As officers moved in to make the arrest, she began to talk, spilling details about the operation that had employed her. Meanwhile, upstairs, the baby remained safely in the pediatric ward, completely unaware of the drama unfolding below. Nurses took turns watching over him, touched by how peacefully he slept through it all. The arrests in the parking garage were just the beginning. Based on information from the woman's phone, and the documents scattered during her escape attempt, police were already moving to intercept other members of the trafficking ring. The Dark Sedan's occupants surrendered without resistance, knowing they were cornered. Inside their car, police found laptops containing files that would prove crucial to dismantling the entire operation, records of other kidnappings, contacts, and bank transactions that spread across multiple countries. As officers led the suspects away in handcuffs, Detective Rodriguez received word that the baby's parents had landed at Seattle International Airport. They were being escorted to the hospital by FBI agents, their 5-day nightmare finally approaching its end. The attempted escape had lasted less than 15 minutes, but its impact would be felt for years to come. Security footage of the chase would later be used in training programs at hospitals across the country, helping to prevent similar incidents. Hospital staff gathered in small groups, discussing the events in hushed tones. Many had worked through similar emergencies before, but this one felt different. This wasn't just about stopping criminals, it was about reuniting a family and exposing a network that had hurt so many others. As the chaos in the parking garage settled, Detective Rodriguez headed back upstairs. There was still work to be done, statements to take, evidence to process. But most importantly, there was a baby boy waiting to see his parents again, and after everything that had happened, ensuring that reunion went smoothly was her top priority. The setting sun cast long shadows through the hospital windows, marking the end of a day that had started with a suspicious woman walking into an emergency room and ended with the beginning of justice for countless families affected by a criminal enterprise that had finally been exposed. The reunion happened just as the last rays of sunlight faded from the Seattle sky. The baby's parents rushed through the hospital corridors, their footsteps echoing with 5 days of desperate hope. When they finally reached the pediatric ward, both were breathless, tears already streaming down their faces. Detective Rodriguez stood quietly by the door as the nurse brought their son to them. The mother's hands trembled as she reached for her baby, and the father wrapped his arms around them both. For a moment, the busy hospital seemed to fall silent, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something sacred. The baby, who had been quiet and withdrawn all day, suddenly came alive in his mother's arms. His tiny hands reached for her familiar face, and his first smile since arriving at the hospital lit up the room. The father gently touched the small birthmark behind his son's ear, the very mark that had helped bring their family back together. Hospital staff who had been involved throughout the day gathered nearby, many wiping away tears of their own. Nurse Richardson, who had first noticed something wasn't right that morning, watched from the doorway as the family she had helped reunite held each other close. But this story was bigger than one family's reunion. In the days that followed, the investigation expanded rapidly. The evidence found in the Dark Sedan led police to a sophisticated network operating across 3 countries. Documents, computer files, and confession after confession revealed the shocking scope of the operation. The woman who had brought the baby to Memorial General wasn't working alone. She was part of a larger organization that had been trafficking infants through fake adoption agencies for years. They had targeted vulnerable families, exploited legal loopholes, and left a trail of heartbreak across multiple states. Within a week, police had raided warehouses in Vancouver, arrested key members of the organization in Nevada, and started the process of tracking down other stolen babies. The case made national headlines, not just for its scope, but for the way it had been broken through the vigilance of hospital staff who trusted their instincts. Changes came quickly to hospital protocols nationwide. New security measures were implemented, staff training was enhanced, and verification procedures were strengthened. The case became a teaching tool, showing how small details, like a nurse noticing inconsistent stories or a security guard spotting suspicious behavior, could unravel even the most sophisticated criminal operations. The baby's parents became advocates for other families, sharing their story to help prevent similar tragedies. Their testimony before Congress helped pass new legislation, strengthening adoption regulations and increasing penalties for child trafficking. Detective Rodriguez continued working the case for months, piecing together the network's operations. Each new discovery led to more families finding answers, more children being returned home, more criminal enterprises being shut down. The woman who had started it all by walking into Memorial General that morning eventually cooperated with authorities. Her testimony proved crucial in dismantling the larger organization. Though she faced serious charges, her information helped bring justice to dozens of families who had been searching for their children. 1 year later, the baby's family returned to Memorial General Hospital. They wanted to thank the staff who had helped bring their son home. The little boy, now walking and babbling happily, brought smiles to the faces of everyone who remembered that intense day. Nurse Richardson hugged the mother tightly, remembering the tension and fear of that morning. "Sometimes," she said, "the most important thing we can do is trust our instincts when something doesn't feel right." The hospital created a new training program using the case to teach staff about recognizing suspicious situations. The security footage from that day became a powerful tool in showing how alert hospital workers could make a crucial difference in protecting vulnerable patients. The dachshund, which had played such a pivotal role in the case, was eventually auctioned off by police. The proceeds went to a new foundation established to help families affected by child trafficking, turning a tool of crime into a force for good. The final arrests in the case came almost 2 years later when international authorities tracked down the organization's leaders. The investigation had grown far beyond that one morning in Seattle, leading to changes in laws, hospital procedures, and the way agencies handled adoptions across multiple countries. But for the family at the heart of it all, the most important outcome was much simpler. Every night, they could tuck their son safely into bed, knowing he was where he belonged. The tiny birthmark behind his ear, once a crucial piece of evidence, became a reminder of the day their family was made whole again. As Detective Rodriguez finally closed the case file, she reflected on how one observant nurse's instincts had started a chain of events that brought justice to so many families. Sometimes, she thought, the biggest cases start with the smallest details and the courage to act when something doesn't feel quite right.